Acts, the 21st chapter. So thankful for the presence of each and every one, for our time to be together, that we can worship God, that we can now take this time to look into His Word and hopefully learn the things that will help to encourage us, to strengthen us, and to give us that continued hope of enduring unto the end, that we can have a home in heaven. The 21st chapter of the book of Acts is Paul ends his third missionary journey, and it talks about his being arrested at Jerusalem. Just to sort of give a little bit of a outline of the book, the first 17 verses deal with the journey that he made from Miletus to Jerusalem. And it's within those 17 verses that we see in the first three, they sail from Miletus to Tyre. Verses 4 through 6, they stay 7 days in Tyre with the disciples. In verses 7 through 9, they come to Caesarea, and there they stay with Philip. In verses 10 and 11, we see the prophet Agabus foretelling of Paul's arrest and his imprisonment. In verses 12 through 14, Paul is determined to go to Jerusalem anyway. And in verses 15 through 17, we see Paul goes to Jerusalem. The second major outline that we can make of the chapter starts at verse 18 and goes through the end of the chapter. There we see him at the end being arrested. We see that Paul goes to James and the elders in verses 18 through 25. He goes into the temple in verse 26. We read about the uproar that takes place in verses 27 through 32, and Paul's arrest in verses 33 through 36. And Paul is given permission to speak in his defense in verses 37 through 40. Most of this chapter is the telling of events. There's not any real sermon or teaching that we have recorded in this 21st chapter. But we do see several people that are mentioned in this chapter. Paul, Philip, Philip's 4 daughters, Agabus, Mnason, James and the elders, the 4 unnamed men in reference to the vow, Trophimus, and the commander Claudius Lysias. These we see are the people who make a difference in the events that are recorded here in chapter 21. And so that's what we want to talk about in our study this evening. People who make a difference. The first one is, there's the man whose children prophesied. In verse 8, let's read verses 8 and 9. On the next day, we who were Paul's companions departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip, the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. So we see here in this that Philip was a man who, I guess for the better way of saying it, he wore many hats, so to speak. We, of course, last hear about Philip back in chapter 8 and verse 40. And from then until where we're reading about him in Acts 21 is something in the neighborhood of about 20 years since we have heard of Philip. We recall, as it's even mentioned here in chapter 21, that he was one of the 7 in Acts chapter 6, when there was the murmuring that arose about the Grecian widow, the neglect of the Grecian widows. We know that he was an evangelist. He proclaimed the gospel. We see that in Acts 8, the first part of the chapter, where he goes to the city of Samaria and converts that city. And of course, we remember Simon, the sorcerer, was one of those individuals in particular that was there. And in the last part of Acts chapter 8, we read about him converting the Ethiopian who had been to Jerusalem to worship and was on his way back home. We know from what we've just read here that he certainly was a hospitable host and that he kept Paul and his companions. And we know that we're told that he was the father of 4 daughters. And obviously, Philip did well in the raising of those daughters. We find the mention is made that they were virgins. That means that they were moral. They are morally pure. We see that they prophesied. That indicates that they were faithful. It gives an indication that they certainly had been trained and had been taught well. And we see that what they were, being virgin daughters who prophesied, speaks volumes about Philip. It says something about his example before his family. It says something about the rules that he obviously must have set. It says something about the things that Philip allowed his daughters to do. It also tells us to a degree that certainly he was strict in many ways concerning them. And it tells us also about his priorities. And the result of all of this is the fact that he has 4 virgin daughters who prophesy. So we can make a difference when we train our children well. When we focus on them maintaining moral purity. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 18, flee sexual immorality. Or as the King James says, flee fornication. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits fornication, sexual immorality, sins against his own body. As parents, our children need to see what our priorities are. And what our priorities are is like in Matthew 6 and verse 33, seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Knowing that if we do this in a spiritual way, we'll be blessed physically. All of these things of a spiritual nature will be added to you. It's in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Be sanctified, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So truly, we need to set our priorities in front of our children. We need to show them how to be active in the Lord's church and in the Lord's service. In Titus chapter 2 and verse 14, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from every lawless deed and purify for himself his own special people, zealous for good works. Our children need to see us as parents involved in studying our Bible study lesson. Our children need to see us as parents taking a part in interest of visiting others, seeing to the needs of others. If we're a man, to see us involved in the teaching of classes, to see us involved in the worship of the church and all of its activities, leading the singing, leading the prayer, helping on the Lord's table, officiating at the Lord's table, leading in prayers. All of these things are things that us as parents need to show our children that we are active and we desire and want them to be active, to be the example of that, not just to say, but to show. And we need to instruct them in the Lord's way. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Another person that makes a difference that we see here in Acts 21 is the man whose heart was breaking. Let's look at verses 12 and read through verse 14. Now, when we heard these things, both we and those from that place pleaded with him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." So when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, "The will of the Lord be done." We see here that in what we're studying, Agabus had prophesied concerning Paul going to Jerusalem and being bound. Notice that in verse 10. I've got a new Bible and it don't have the verses where I would like for them to be, so it's a little hard for me to find them. And as we stayed many days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. When he had come to us, he took Paul's belt, bound his own hands and feet, and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." It's with that we see Paul's traveling companions, which of course Luke, the author of the book of Acts, was one of them. His traveling companions and those brethren that were here at this place, they pleaded with Paul and they wept with him, like we saw in verse 12. And we followed a statement in verse 13 that they broke Paul's heart. "Why did you weep and break my heart?" That word break means to crush. It means to discourage. It means to sadden. So yet Paul was determined to go anyway, in spite of the danger, despite of their emotional pleas that obviously had to be pounding at his heart. And they were trying, as A.T. Robertson makes the comment on this 13th verse, they were trying to weaken his determination to go on with his duty because they knew what would happen, what was going to be coming when he goes to Jerusalem. So, yet, he was determined to do the right thing. And others are begging him not to go. You know, brethren saw his determination. We read that in verse 14. So, being determined to go regardless, they stopped their weeping. And we see that they stopped their pleadings. And instead, they said, "The will of the Lord be done." You know, today, there are those who want to do the right thing, and yet others may be breaking their hearts. Children may want to go to class, but parents won't take them. I've known of instances where children have wanted to go to services, and their parents, not being Christians, wouldn't take them. What do you think those children are today? There's a parent who wants to discipline his children, but he has a mate that doesn't. And we know the conflict and the problems that can and does cause in a home when both parents cannot be agreed, especially when it comes to such an important matter as discipline children. What I'm saying is that there are those who want to do what's right, but so often they have friends that when they find out what they want to do, they ridicule them. And in all of this, hearts are broken. By that we mean they're discouraged. By that we just simply mean that they're crushed. They're saddened. And it depends upon the moral and spiritual strength of that individual, whether or not they will continue to go on and do the right thing, or whether they will let this type of ridicule, this type of not allowing this type of things that break their heart to stop them, prevent them from doing the things they know that they ought to be doing. Another person that made the difference is people that were misinformed. Let's look at verse 20 and read verse 21. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord, and they said, You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all of the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. Here we see were Jewish Christians, and they had been misinformed. They had received the wrong information. Who are these Jewish Christians? Well, obviously they're new converts. So those that have not been Christians very long. They are obviously zealous for the law. And the interesting thing is that there were thousands of them. We read it from the New King James Version, they were myriads. Thousands, as the Old King James says. So this shows how serious this misinformation has become. Well, who's responsible for it? Well, it's not the new converts, because they're the ones that must have been told about it to start with. It could have been the Jewish teachers, those who should have known better. And it could be those that just simply didn't listen carefully. That can also be a source of being misinformed, misunderstanding. What was it they were told? They were told that Paul taught to forsake Moses, that he taught not to circumcise their children. He taught them not to walk according to the customs. What was the truth in the situation? They were misinformed. Here's what they were misinformed into believing. But what was the truth in the situation? We know that the law of Moses regulated the civil, the social, and the spiritual lives. The law of Moses covered that entire spectrum: social, civil, and spiritual. And we know that when the law ceased, they still kept some of the customs. And we need to understand the use that's being made in this verse of the word custom. Yes, they'd been under the law of Moses, the law had ceased, but they still kept some of the customs. They could still abstain from certain foods, because we see that mentioned in Romans chapter 14. It doesn't matter whether a man eats or whether he eats meat or whether he eats vegetables. If a person living under the law had thought that it was just not good at all to eat any meat, then certainly that was fine. But he could also continue to eat meat or refrain from eating meat. It was a custom to him. And that's what we see Romans 14 talking about. It mattered either way, whether he ate or whether he did not eat. The same thing can be said concerning the circumcision of children. Remember, Paul made the statement in Galatians 5 and verse 6, "For in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but faith working through love." So what we see then is that here's another thing that falls into the realm of Romans 14. It matters neither way with God, whether you circumcise or not, whether you eat meat or not. And even in chapter 14, he talks about the observing of certain days. Again, that does not matter one way or the other with the Lord. And so then, we see that what Paul actually taught was that the law of Moses had ended. We see that in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 14. Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, that was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 and 25, therefore the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. So that's what Paul taught. And Paul taught that no one is saved by obeying the law in the law of Moses. In Romans chapter 3 and verse 20, therefore by the deeds of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. And, however, he did not teach no one could be circumcised as a matter of custom, because that's what he did in the case of Timothy. Remember in Acts 16 and verse 3? Well, I thought I had the verse there. Let's see. I may have messed up on my slide, so excuse me. If I've not got it there, then I'll read it. Okay. Romans 3. There we go. Acts 16 and verse 3. Paul wanted to have, this is talking about Timothy. Paul wanted to have him to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in that region, for they all knew that his father was Greek. But what we see is that Paul did not teach that no one could keep the customs of the law. And that's what we see taking place here in Acts chapter 21. There's a lot of misinformation about us. And I think we know that. If we talk to people or people have talked to us, there are a lot of misinformation that circulates on what we teach, what we practice. Some people say, well, y'all don't have music in worship. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We have music in worship because we must understand that there is two forms of music. There is vocal and there is mechanical. God has authorized vocal music in Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16. But just because we don't use mechanical instruments of music is a far cry from the truth being stated whenever it says you all don't use music in your worship, because we do. We use vocal music, the kind that's authorized in the scriptures. Some people say, well, you don't believe that instruments can be used even in secular songs. That's not true. I love secular music. When I was growing up, I loved mostly instrumental music. One of my favorite groups was Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. So I love music. I love all of the various mechanical musical instruments. So no, it's a misstatement for somebody to say concerning those that are members of the Lord Church that you all don't believe in instruments to the point where you don't even believe that they ought to be used in secular music. Well, there's nothing to be further from the truth. Been misinformed. Somebody else said, well, you don't believe in taking care of the orphans. This was the cry back in the 50s and 60s, and when the institutional question was dividing the Lord churches right and left. That was always the emotional cry that came from those that were teaching that you had to have Bible authority, Bible examples for taking money out of the treasury and sending it to a benevolent organization to whether to take care of orphans or widows or whatever the case might be. Here comes this misinformed charge, well, you all don't believe in taking care of orphans. Or you all don't believe in church cooperation. That was the more general statement when it comes to the issues concerning whether or not the church can support church can financially support a missionary institution, whether it's the Herald of Truth or whatever it be, that they then in turn will proclaim the gospel. So it went from y'all don't believe in taking care of orphans to the statement that y'all don't believe in church cooperation. And the truth of the matter is that it couldn't be anything statement made further from the truth. We've heard this one. You all believe the water saves. I may have told you this one before, but the church in Big Stone Gap was located right on the side of a river. And Dad one time on the radio program was preaching about baptism, and one of the fellows that was there at the radio program after Dad finished the program made the statement, said, if I believed in the water, if I believed in baptism as much as you all do, I would stand down there beside the church building and shove everybody into the river that come along. Well, he's been misinformed. No, we do not believe that water saves a person from sin. And some people say, you don't believe that we ought to study or read the Old Testament. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. It's written for our learning. There's a lot of things that we learn. We learn more about God. We learn more about his relationship and his dealings with man. How that mankind has that responsibility, and when that responsibility is not upheld, then God brings judgment. And it's the same today. It's like the lesson that we studied this morning concerning nakedness. We're able to know that the showing of the thigh is nakedness because of what we read in the Old Testament. And certainly we can get caught up and spend more time in it, but I don't think that's a problem here with me. I hope it isn't, or anyone else that I know of personally. The Old Testament has its place. But for someone to say that, well, you don't believe or that you ought to study or read the Old Testament is certainly a misinformed. It's a misunderstanding that people have. Another person that made a difference in Acts 21 is the man who demonstrated his convictions. Let's go to verse 22 and read through verse 27. And again, I'll find it just a second. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles, we believe we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. So here's what we see in these verses that we've read. The elders give advice. I'm not sure. I may have my slides mixed up. Okay. The elders give advice here in verses 22 through 24. See, there are many Christians, thousands, myriads, as the New King James says, who will not know, they know you're here, as verse 22 states. And so they're told in verse 23 and 24 to take these 4 men who have taken a vow. And the best I can assume is that this is the Nazirite vow, like what we read about in the book of Numbers in the 6th chapter. That one could associate himself with them by going to the temple with them and paying the expenses that were customary. And we see that they may have gotten this idea from previous actions that Paul had engaged in. Like the example in Acts 18 and verse 8. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Caesarea, for he had taken a vow. So all of this, according to the elders that are here, it would show that the rumor was wrong concerning Paul, and that you keep the law. And the law, of course, is being spoken of here in the context of what we're reading. Keeping the law in the sense of keeping the customs of the law, as we read there in verse 24. So then, the elders want to be, however, very clear in this matter. Notice again what we read there in verse 25. But according to the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. So see, the elders make it clear that this action that they are asking on the part of Paul is not against the conclusions that we reach back there in the 15th chapter of Acts, with the matter of circumcision being forced upon the Gentiles that had become Christians, that they must be circumcised and keep things of the law of Moses in order to be saved. So the elders make it clear that this is not whatsoever. Our position has not changed whatsoever in this regard. The law is not bound, not to be bound upon the Gentiles. And Paul follows their advice. We see that as we read in verses 26 and 27. And he just didn't tell that he observed the customs, but he showed his belief. So, we always say actions speak louder than words, and certainly that's a case here in what Paul is doing. He was practicing the principle that he had stated when he wrote to the church at Corinth by inspiration in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20. And to the Jews I become as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those that are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. So then, we see this is a case of Paul putting his money where his mouth was. And there'll be times when people are watching us to see if we're going to demonstrate our convictions. And two, another instance of the person that made a difference is the people that we read about in verse 28. It says, crying out, men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all of the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, away with him. So here we see people that were caught up in a mob. We see here how a mob operates. And it's no different today. We've seen a lot of that in the last several months, in the last year or so. But mobs are mobs for the most part. A mob operates because there's just only a few that it takes to stir up the rest. That's the way it's always worked. It just takes a very few to get everybody else worked up. And they all get worked up more times than not over something that's not true. Something that's been said, a report that's been given, somebody supposes something to be the case, and then the mob is formed. A lot of people get upset, just like we've read in these verses. And certainly in a mob, it never fails that there's confusion. And this mob here was no different. Some were saying one thing, some were saying the other. Nobody could get the story straight. And certainly we see that they acted rashly. So these are the things that made up this mob. And we often see this herd mentality, I guess is the best way of putting it, or this jumping on the bandwagon sort of effect. We see it being used by Christians. When they make the statement in order to justify something that they ought not to be doing, they say, well, everybody else is doing it. What's that? That's this mentality, this bandwagon herd. Or somebody, if you're trying to teach them the truth, somebody replies that, well, you know, most people believe so-and-so. So we see it's just another case where it's easily to be swayed by the group or the majority of what people believe and think. And then, of course, there's that peer pressure that we always talk about. We won't have time to read Proverbs chapter 1, verses 10 through 19, of where that there was pressure being put on a young man to lose his soul, to become impure in the actions that he was being encouraged to do. Peer pressure is tremendous. It's great. And it really knows no age group. Young, middle age, old, peer pressure is everywhere. It's not limited, restricted whatsoever by age. And then there was the man that made assumptions. We saw that in verse 38. Let's go back and look at it just briefly. Well, let's read it. I guess we ought to say. Then Paul was about, verse 37, Paul was about to be led into the barracks. He said to the commander, may I speak to you? He replied, can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? So here was this man, this commander, Claudius Lysias, who now makes an assumption. He assumes something about Paul that's not at all the truth. He makes mention of an Egyptian revolutionary who led a Jewish rebellion against the Roman government. And he said, Lysias said that he led 4,000 followers into the wilderness. He calls them assassins. Pretty bad group of guys, you might say. And secular history tells us that he had fooled this number of men into believing that the walls of Jericho were going to fall at his command. And then they would be able to overpower the Roman rulers. So what we see is Lysias assumes Paul was that Egyptian, that leader. And could very well be that one of the things that may have persuaded him of that being the case was because Paul spoke Greek. And that we see in verse 37 that we read. And Egyptians spoke Greek. So we see the connection that Lysias makes. The guy that led the rebellion spoke Greek. Paul speaks Greek. Paul is in this mess. So, I've got the leader of the man that's trying to overthrow the government. And you know, people today, they make unfounded assumptions. They assume that the text assume something that the text does not say. That's easy to do. It's easy to do with people, making assumptions about a person, maybe a first impression, and it's not true. Well, it holds true when it comes to what the scriptures teach. They assume that the text says something that it doesn't say. They assume what is being said, and then they respond based upon that assumption. And really the response is not in any way knowing the truth in the matter, because they have made an assumption that it's not true. It's easy to assume motives without evidence. That's an easy assumption to be made. It's easy to assume, like what we read here in verses 28 and 29, that Paul was the one that was guilty, when the case in the matter was that that was the farthest thing from the truth in the matter. So we see, in continuing to look at Lysias, he also was a man who was searching for the truth. In verse 33, remember what he said? Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and he asked him who he was and what he had done. So here Lysias seeks to know the facts. What he does is he asks Paul, who are you? He asks, what have you done? And we see what Lysias is doing here is he's searching for answers. He's made his assumptions, and that's rather interesting because sometimes people will carry through on their assumptions regardless of the facts, regardless of the evidence. But that's not the case with Lysias. He's made an assumption, but he's seeking for the truth. Who are you? What have you done? So he's searching for the answers. And the remarkable thing about this man was he was willing to give up his assumptions. He was willing to do away with those first impressions that are so impressionable upon us when he learned the truth. Let's read verse 37 and go through verse 39. Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who sometimes stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So we see that he allows Paul, he's willing to let Paul speak for himself. And so in verse 40, so when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hands to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. You know, those individuals that are seeking the truth are truly commendable people. We read so often and so often quote Acts 17 and verse 11. These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica. The King James says these were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. So we need to seek to know the truth. In John 17, verse 17, Jesus said, "Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth." We need to be willing to always search for the answers. We need to be willing to change our views. We need to be willing to give up our preconceived ideas and not continue to operate our lives based on misinformation, based on assumptions that we might make, based upon first impressions that we might receive. We need to allow time and opportunity for truth, for facts to serve as evidence for us then to act, to respond in whatever the situation might be. So these are the people that made a difference in Acts, the 21st chapter. Again, it's not a chapter with sermon or any kind of particular teaching that the Apostle Paul did, but it's a record of events. It's sort of a record of history that we find, as well as the rest of the chapter of Acts, as it goes on and concludes concerning this journey that Paul makes. People make a difference. And that's what we're here on this earth for, is to make a difference. To make a difference by way of doing God's will, being his servant, putting our will aside to do his will, letting our light so shine that men may see our good works and glorify God which is in heaven. To be a light, to be the salt of the earth. That's our purpose. But we can only be both of those if we ourselves obey the gospel and continue faithful in obedience to that gospel. So tonight, if you're here and you're not a Christian, think about it. Your soul is at stake. Your soul that will last eternally and will spend eternally in either one or two places. Of all of the things that you might amass to your possessions and your control in this life, when you come to the judgment day and you lose your soul, you'd be willing to give all of that up. Don't we see that in the case of Luke 16 and the rich man and Lazarus? See, his life completely changed at death. He had fared sumptuously, but upon his death, he was begging rather than Lazarus. He was begging for water to cool his tongue. He was begging for Abraham to send Lazarus back to warn his 5 brothers. You know, I've often thought about that. I just wonder sometimes how many people are there in the Hadean world that are wishing that somebody, some way, somehow could reach the family members that are still living here on this earth. But it's not going to happen. Just as the rich man had those brothers, they had Moses and the law. Well, what's true for you and us today is we have the law of Christ, that perfect law of liberty that can free us of sin, remove the barrier that has separated us from God, and be his child, he be our Father, be obedient to him, express our love to him in the keeping of his commandments, and do that all of the days of our lives. And heaven could be our home. When we go to that Hadean world, we will be comforted, like Lazarus was in Abraham's bosom. And then on that final day of judgment, we can hear our Lord say, well done. If you're subject to this invitation as either one who's never obeyed or one that has and has gone and let sin into your life, we stand ready to assist you that your soul may be saved, because we never know when life is going to be taken from us. Please come to the front while together we stand to